Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in tonight in these COVID times. I had three lectures on this topic from the start of the year, and they were all canceled. So it's good to be able to do this with all of you tonight. I hope you enjoy it. So, A Moonlight Massacre. Uh, this was this was my first book. Yeah, as Simon mentioned, it was published in 2014. And it was interesting how I came across the topic. I guess you could say, one of the fundamental drives of a historian, my former advisor, Dr. John Bourne, told me was curiosity. And I was certainly curious about this particular action. I was at Ypres. It was probably sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s. And some of you may remember the old shell hole bed and breakfast. And it was run by a gentleman, an ex-para, who was a bit surly at times, but very nice and helpful. And I was just doing a casual self-browse, and he had the bed and breakfast, but they also had a secondhand bookshop. And I saw a copy of Boriston and Bax's The Eighth Division, which was published in 1926. And I just pulled it off the shelf just to have a look through and opened the book, and a map appeared. And it said Passchendaele, 2nd December 1917. And I thought, December 1917, what's this about? The campaign ended on the 10th of November 1917. And I remember going out the next day, and I was standing in the vicinity of Vindictive Crossroads, which is now, of course, Vindictive Roundabout. But and looking off to the east and saying, well, it happened around here someplace, but I couldn't really find much mention of it at all. In as much as having read the official history, published in 1948, it's completely ignored. So I thought, well, what happened here? And when I decided to return and do grad school, and master's in the States, and then my PhD at the University of Birmingham, I thought that this would be a good topic to look into, and I began the research on it. And of course, it culminated in the book. And of course, such a minor operation. I remember somebody said to me once, well, it was just this nasty little operation. I mean, who cares? And so, I think that there is some relevance to it, in as much as the existing literature and reinterpretation of 30 campaign's final stages. To give you an example, Hill 52, which was one of the objectives of the attack, claimed in both the British official history and the Canadian official history, and has been repeated ever since up until recently, that Hill 52, which was a key objective on the northern part, a key eminence on the northern part of the Passchendaele Ridge, had fallen into Canadian hands on the 10th of November 1917. But in doing my research, I said, well, wait a minute, Hill 52 is an objective in the attack that I'm researching. How could that possibly be? And we'll discuss that shortly. But there's an example. Also, as far as the newest historiography goes, it was an excellent case study of the British formulaic approach to operations circa late 1970. And what I mean by that is that, by the time of the Plumer offensives, Battle of the Menenrode Ridge, 20th September 1917, Polygon Wood, 26th of September, and Broodseinde. The way that attacks are between the headquarters are coordinated is that Army would issue a general order with a map showing what objectives needed to be taken. This would be passed on to corps, and corps were expected to work with their divisions to seize objectives. And this practice, of course, was still occurring at the time of this tailpiece to the 30th campaign. And one other thing to keep in mind about this attack, I had one reviewer, and rightfully so, claim that on reading my account that it made him angry. And of course, there is a lot about this particular operation in hindsight that is infuriating. That these men, seemingly, to us today, were sacrificed to no purpose. But at the time it seemed necessary and important. And certainly the commanders that were in charge were making the best of a bad job. And of course, the problem with command is that, if you are in error, people are going to die. So it's just something to keep in mind, uh, as I relate what happened in this particular operation, uh, have some empathy for the decision makers, in addition, of course, to the men who fought in the attack. So, in understanding this particular operation, just uh, the Third Battle of Ypres, in context. I'm sure most of the audience that's here tonight is familiar with the general outline of the campaign, but just to run through it quickly in regard to this map, you have what you call the strategic phase of the campaign. And what I mean by that is that it's a series of attacks from the opening phase of the so-called Northern Operation, following the siege on the 1st of July to the 12th of October. And what the British are attempting to do is to seize Passchendaele Ridge, but also there is a wider objective, strategic objective, and that is to clear the Belgian coast, to drive the Germans out of Belgium by seizing key railway junctions at Roussillon and Thurot. And so those attacks continue with that object in mind until the First Battle of Passchendaele, which is a serious reverse, where you have terrible ground conditions, unfortunate weather, and of course, resolute German defense. So the post-strategic phase then that follows, and that's when the Canadians are brought in, and you have a series of attacks along with British corps from the 26th of October to the 10th of November. And what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to get as much as the main Passchendaele Ridge, if you see on the cursor here, as much as the range of the main Passchendaele Ridge as possible before the onset of winter, because of course British GHQ, Sir Douglas Haig, they were hoping that the Lloyd George government would allow a continuation of this offensive at the beginning, in the spring of 1918. So to gain the most of the ridges possible, because it's interesting, if you go to Flanders and you go to the outskirts of Roussillon and you look back, you can see how the ridge dominates the plain towards Roussillon, and it's downhill all the way, but you have to seize that high ground. And so that's why the attacks continued. It's certainly, in hindsight, we can say that, there was no possibility that the Lloyd George government would allow a continuation of the Flanders offensive in 1918. But, we know that now. Haig certainly, believed in his strategy and, was hoping that he would be permitted to do so. The circumstances didn't allow for it, but that's another story. So, strategic phase. On the 10th of November, you have your final attacks. And if you look at the bulge here, what we're most concerned with here, here's your Holthus Forest in the north. We're most concerned here is this salient around Passchendaele, the Passchendaele salient, which is what I'll refer to it as. Okay, and this area was seized by the Canadian Corps, and certainly in the final attack, the neighboring Second Corps under Lieutenant General Claude Jacob, they joined in the final attack to the northeast of Passchendaele, but they failed. It was the 1st British Division that was involved. So by that time, Sir Henry Rawlinson had assumed command of 2nd Army. He had spent most of 1917 on the sidelines. He was up north on the Flanders coast, preparing for an amphibious attack and a drive along the coast towards Ostend and Zeebrugge. But of course, that never came off. And so after the Italian rout at Caporetto in October of 1917 and into November, the French government and the British government insisted that divisions be sent to bolster the Italians. And the commander of the British force sent to Italy was Plumer, General Plumer, commanding 2nd Army, who of course is in the middle of a major offensive in Flanders, but it was insisted that Plumer be sent and Rawlinson took his place. So Rawlinson is the one, the army commander, who oversees this operation, this night operation on the Passchendaele Ridge. So when does when does 30 officially terminate? Well, officially terminates on the 20th of November, although the last attack official is on the 10th of November. So by that, so certainly in the run up to Cambrai, Haig, in conversations with Rawlinson, recommends, that he continue operations along the ridge, and it might even possibly help divert the Germans from the attack down south by Third Army. So although it's quite nebulous, I can't find there's only a passage in Haig's diary and also in Rawlinson's diary where they've discussed this, but there's not really any details. In any case, the attack is allowed to go in. And one other thing that I need to mention just briefly before I go on is that this attack was supposed to be part of a series of attacks along the Passchendaele Ridge, because up here in the north, you'll see we have West-Trosabik, which is a virtual German fortress. And attacks against West-Trosabik from the west are across ground that's impassable by this time. It's a swamp. It's impossible. So the only way that they can threaten West-Trosabik is to advance along the ridge. So there's a map that I found in the Second Corps War Diary that shows this series of bites that are going to be taken along the ridge to try and dominate West-Trosabik. Rawlinson's thoughts strategically were that West-Trosabik would be captured, but then he only he decided that they would just get within range to threaten it. Possibly the Germans might evacuate it. I don't know. That isn't brought up in any of the documents. But if you look at the map that I mentioned, it's this series of bites that are taken, and by different divisions that are brought in and out of the line. What essentially happened is that the operation that I wrote about was supposed to be the first one of that series, but right before it was launched, they decided that it would be only a local operation, and any further attacks, once the objectives were taken on the 2nd of December, as hoped, that would be the end. There would be no more advances during the winter. So I'm talking about the Passchendaele salient, and the Passchendaele salient, according to a report of the time, it was an exact semicircle with a radius of 1,300 yards. So here you have a simplified map of the salient itself. And so what was the High Command trying to accomplish? And it had a lot to do with observation. Before we look at the passage here, I mentioned the Canadian attacks. And the Canadians, once their attacks were over with, it was unknown exactly where the line was. And it's interesting, it was the same for the Germans. A map I found in the German archives shows a dotted line with question marks around this same period. They weren't even certain where their front line was. But as I mentioned earlier, what was discovered is that Hill 52, which was situated right here, was not in British hands. And not only that, there were no good observation points. They couldn't look into the valleys to the northeast, or the north, or the northwest, where they were currently at. And so this attack, it was hoped they would see just enough of the high ground observation that it would improve British positions on the ridge. So the objective was to make a short advance from a dangerously exposed salient on a 2,870-yard front north and northwest of Passchendaele. On the right, the 8th Regular Division, 8th Corps, that's Lieutenant General Sir Elmer Hunter Weston, would assault with 1 brigade. On the left, the 32nd New Army Division, 2nd Corps, under Lieutenant General Claude Jacob, utilizing a reinforced brigade, was to prolong the left flank and secure important observation points whilst expanding the salient for projected winter operations and increased defensive security. And of course, the projected winter operations are previous to it becoming a local operation. But essentially, here is your 8th Division objectives here. And here are your 32nd objectives here. There was a preliminary operation that was being considered to seize Hill 52, but it was canceled, and Hill 52 was included as part of 32nd Division's objectives. Now, normally what I would do in this talk is I'd ask the audience if anybody wants to chime in through a message. But if you notice the core boundaries here, does anybody notice anything rather odd about this? And my question relates to the fact that, we're talking about a front of attack of only 2,870 yards in what is already a very narrow salient. It's a very strange thing that is in contravention, at least in my interpretation, to field service regulations. Anybody have any idea? Well, if not, and I realize that this venue doesn't allow for this easily anyway, you see some real administrative bad practice here. In that, why would you have an attack with a boundary between two corps in such a narrow salient? Wouldn't it be better to turn over this entire operation to one corps? I don't know why Rawlinson allowed for this. I can't explain it, but it certainly caused problems. And although I'm going ahead of myself slightly, once the attack was over, all of this was turned over, that is the salient, to Hunter Weston, who was not happy about it, but more on that later. So I put these two pictures in here. I won't keep them up for very long. I didn't use them in the book because unfortunately at the time they were not in my possession to do so. But they came from a 3rd Canadian Division intelligence report. And these are abstracts, so I've zoomed in on the area that I want to look at. But just for those of you who have visited the battlefield, I want to just give you an idea also of the ground. And these were taken in October 1917. And this is the Bellevue Spur here. There's the road, Waterloo, and there's the road that runs up to Bellevue. You have your Passchendaele New Cemetery around here, I believe. Okay, Passchendaele is here. And your attack by the 8th Division is to the northeast of Passchendaele. So in this area here. But this is an oblique picture that shows you a general photo of the area. I haven't been able to find many of these, so I thought I'd share these with you tonight. And then the second one is of the 32nd Division sector. You have Hodeberg, which is here. You can see the swampy ground, but Hodeberg, and in this area here, okay, the Hodeberg. But this here, actually, this is the Hodeberg, excuse me. This area is the Vat Cottages Ridge. More on in a moment. And then you have the environs of what throws a beak here. But this is where 32nd Division's attack goes in over this outcrop from the Passchendaele Ridge. More on that in a moment. So, look at it from the tactical aspect. There was a serious problem that faced Schutz's attack. And one of the things that there's a contradiction about is, what was the main effort? Some of the documents that I've read, it was the 8th Division on the right that was making the main effort. Whereas in other accounts, usually regimental histories, certain later books, they'll say that it was 32nd Division attacking the Vat Cottages Ridge. In any case, the most difficult tactical problems were faced by the 32nd Division. And so you had Major General Cameron Shood, who I'm sure you've all heard of. Alan Herbert's poem that shit showed when he was the commander of the Royal Naval Division. But he knew from captured German documents that were disseminated throughout the BEF at this time that the Germans, in holding their positions, were practicing something called der Leere Gefechtsfelder, the hidden battlefield. And what you had is you had an outpost zone. Let me just hear, oh, excuse me there, sorry about that. You had an outpost zone, trying to see here. Here's your British front line, okay? And you had this outpost zone, a Vorfeld zone. And what that essentially was is that was the early warning system of when a British attack, was about to be launched. And then behind it, you had the main line of resistance, where the German High Command expected the main battle to be. This was not something that was to be given up easily. Okay, the Hauptwiderstandslinie here, the main line of resistance. So by this time, in the German Fourth Army, the orders were that if a British barrage opened on the outpost zone, the Vorfeld zone, that the garrison, who somehow, I don't know how they were supposed to do this, but they had to discern whether or not it was a big attack or, let's say, a raid. But if they discerned it was a big attack, they were to fall back to the main line of resistance. And once that was done, a German barrage would be brought down on the British front line and would work its way back and forth over that position between the Vorfeld zone linie and the British front line. So shelling no man's land, and thereby inflicting severe casualties on the attackers before they even got to the main line of resistance here. So how to overcome something like that? And Schutt came up with a very novel but flawed set piece of assault scheme. And his plan is that for the first 8 minutes of the attack, that the attackers would go in with the bayonet and they would overrun the Vorfeld zone linie and then make their way to the main line of resistance. And by the time that they were on the main line of resistance, it would be too late. And the German garrison would hopefully be overwhelmed and they could push on to their relatively short objectives beyond. And one other thing that Schutt insisted upon, Schutt was a proponent of attacks in the half-light. He believed, and I think rightfully so, which I'll get to in a moment, but he believed, I think rightfully so, that you had to have some relative moonlight so the attackers could maintain formation and direction. And you see this, for instance, in the Second World War, I'm sure some of you have read about Monty's Moonlight, where they would shine searchlights into the sky to reflect down, to give some artificial moonlight so attacks could go in. And Schutt was correct in this and was a proponent of this sort of thing. There was a successful attack launched in early 1917 on the Yonk, where this was put into practice, and they were able to gain their objectives. But there was a flaw, which we will get into, but not just yet. So, all well and good. However, the neighboring attacking division, the 8th Division under General Henniker, Billy Henniker, who commanded 8th Division since December 1916, he had reservations. He said, well, I understand the strategy behind this, but what happens if the German machine guns open up on us before those 8 minutes are up? And of course, in war, 8 minutes can be a long time. But what happens if these machine guns opened up on his men? What do we do? And he even came up, with some alternatives, engaging the German machine guns if they opened up with Lewis guns, bringing down a barrage. And these were all rejected by Schutt. Schutt thought it would complicate things, and he was supported by the corps commanders, certainly by Jacob, who was Schutt's corps commander, and also by Hunter Weston, who went against Henniker. Henniker was not happy. He didn't think much of Hunter Weston. In his diary, he wrote in the autumn of 1917 that Hunter Weston was mad and very trying, and that such corps commanders should not be allowed out there. However, to get a more balanced view of Hunter Weston, I really recommend the newest biography that's come out about him, A Slashing Man of Action, which is certainly well worth reading, and I think puts Hunter Weston's command style in a perspective that's certainly much more balanced. So, all the practicalities of the planning for the attack out of the way, 0 hour was set for 1:55 a.m. on the 2nd of December, 1917. So, upset and orders of battle. Now, this map from the book depicts the attacking forces as they were just prior to 0. Although, bear with me 1 second here. It's just something I need to check. Yes, okay, we are in the right spot. So what you have is on the right, you have the 8th Division, the 8th Royal Berks, and the 2nd Lincolns, and the 2nd Rifle Brigade of the 25th Brigade of the 8th Division, commanded by Brigadier General Clifford Coffin, V.C. And opposite them is the 25th Hessian Division. On the left, the 32nd Division, you have the 97th Brigade under Brigadier General Cyril Aubrey Blacklock. And this is a reinforced brigade. So, 97th Brigade, 5 battalions, because 2 are from the 96th Brigade, with 1 as a counterattack battalion. So what you have in mind here is the 2nd Rifle Brigade, the 2nd King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, the 16th Highland Light Infantry, the 11th Border Regiment, the 17th Highland Light Infantry, and the 15th Lancashire Fusiliers. And just behind here at Euro Farm is the 16th Northumberland Fusiliers. And their job is to be a counterattack battalion. That is, should the Germans launch a counterattack against the forces that have gone on ahead, the battalion commander, Colonel Scully, would send his men in to reinforce the units in front. That and the objectives are, you see the objective here. There are 2 redoubts for the 8th Division and a trench in between. So you have, for the Royal Berks, they are going to set up a flank guard here at Exert Farm. Here's Passchendaele here. So here at Exert Farm. The 2nd Lincolns are primarily to see the trench in between, called Venison Trench. And then to the north is what they call the Northern Redoubt. So Southern Redoubt and Northern Redoubt are connected by this trench. And, it's a rather odd position for this period, because in the Leer de Gevestvelde defensive plan, you were holding scattered shell holes. But you could have a linear position, but it would be almost impossible to discern from the air. But in this particular case, the Germans are actually holding a linear trench. And I couldn't understand why this was until I visited the battlefield. And I was in a car driving along the Donkorstraat, which is here, just outside of Passchendaele, in this wishbone here. I was driving along the Donkorstraat, and what I noted, when I got to about this point where the trench was and started to head down, I noticed that the landscape opened up beyond to the east, and I could see all the billeting villages and even the outskirts of Rousselard. So that's why the Germans held on to this position the way that they did, because for the British just to advance a tiny bit here, just to seize this just beyond Venison Trench, they can see into their hinterland beyond. The same applies here for the 32nd Division. You have this outcrop here. called the Vat Cottages Ridge. Here it is. It sticks out of the main ridge. And it overlooks German positions toward the north, towards Spree here, and then you have the Holtus Forest beyond that, and also to the northwest, to the outskirts of Balkapal. And so to capture this ridge, this tiny outcrop, would give the British certainly, they would make things very difficult to the German garrisons to the north and the northwest, and also the garrison in West Rosebika itself. And so the divisional commander, the German divisional commander, this is the 38th Thuringian Division, he said that, this ground would be held at all costs because it was all vital, and they were unwilling to give up any of it. So, battlefield conditions on the night of the 1st and 2nd December. And I'm going to go back to the previous map, but communication routes to the front line, just to give you an idea of what they're dealing with. One of the things that I state in the book is that considering the conditions at this time, you're holding this salient. It's being bombarded from 3 sides, and sometimes even from the rear. At one point in late November, Rawlinson wrote in his diary that the conditions at Passchendaele and Embrons were terrible, with dead bodies lying about everywhere and no way to remove them because of the constant shelling. And so getting the men up to the line that night would be somewhat difficult. And another problem that occurred, and one thing I need to go back to here, is that here you have your Passchendaele West Rosebika Road, and you'll notice this little position here, Peel Cottage. Peel Cottage was a small pillbox that the Worcester Regiment, the 8th Division, captured, was abandoned by the Germans, captured one night in late November, and put a small garrison in. And during a period of time when they were shifting boundaries, the 32nd Division ended up taking it over also. And so what happened is that on the 30th of November, so within 24 hours or so of the time that the attack goes in, the Germans launch a small attack. And what's happened is that in the days leading up to the attack on the 2nd of December, the British are sending out patrols at night to capture ground in no man's land, and also taking bites out of the Vorfeld zone linie, or the positions in front of the Vorfeld zone linie. And the Germans get nervous, so they launch a small local attack, which is repelled all along the front. But unfortunately, they captured Peel Cottage. And so why is Peel Cottage important? Well, it's unfortunate also how it was discovered on the morning of the 1st of December. Well, prior to dawn, a company commander of the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, the 1st Battalion, they are holding the line prior to this attack. They're just line holding. And the company commander leaves his shell hole position before dusk, before dawn, to check on his men. And he had a party of 8 or 10 men holding that pillbox at Peel Cottage Head. And he went forward, and it was heard. It says in the war diary, they said, somebody go, "Wer da?" And then the machine gun opened up, and this poor captain was gunned down. And that's how that they found out that the Germans were holding the position. And why it was important is it's right on the boundary of the 2 attacking divisions. You have the 2nd Rifle Brigade here and the 2nd Coilies here. And of course, the 2nd Coilies are going for Hill 52, which is one of the key objectives of this attack. It is right there. And so one of the memoirs that I used for this, it was one of the only ones of someone who was an actual participant. The book is The Anger of the Guns by John Nettleton. He was the liaison officer with the 2nd Coilies, and he says that, the fox was amongst the hens once it was discovered that the Germans had occupied Peel Cottage. And so one of the puzzles of this particular attack is it doesn't seem that anybody was aware at this time of how serious the situation was. Indeed, when the 2nd Coilies and the Rifle Brigade take up their positions on the night of the 1st and 2nd of December, this is when they find out. Previous to that, local attack had been launched. Part of the 16th Northumberland Fusiliers, the counterattack battalion, was involved, but they got absolutely nowhere. So in marching to the front line, you already have this obstacle, which could really disrupt the attack. And it appears to me, from what I can gather, is the decision was made on the spot that they would just try and seize it in the general attack. So bringing the units up to the front line was a task in itself. For 32nd Division, they had use of the road running from Gravenstaffel up to Vindictive Crossroads. But where the real difficulty lay then was leaving the road and having to cross the swampy ground to get into positions in front of the Patabeek stream here for these battalions. The Highland Light Infantry, 16th Battalion, 17th Highland, 15th Lancashire Fusiliers. 2nd Coilies, as I mentioned earlier, are going to attack Hill 52, and you have the 2nd Rifle Brigade for the 8th Division now going for the Northern Redoubt, which is here. And to reiterate again, 2nd Lincolns for the Venison Trench and Southern Redoubt, 2nd Royal Berks, and your flank guard here. The 8th Division's communications were, there was a duckboard track called Duckboard Track Number 5, and reading the accounts of these men trying to get in position prior to the operation it was a nightmare. The history of the Royal Berkshire Regiment says heartbreaking in getting up to the line, but they did manage to do it. There were some casualties amongst one company from artillery while they were on the track. So 2 companies of the West York's Regiment were sent to reinforce, but they didn't take part in the attack. So battlefield conditions again. Moon was just past the full sphere, and there was a light snow on the ground, and visibility was good up to 300 yards. And just once again, to give you an idea of the conditions, this is a photo taken of that cottages in vicinity on the 26th of November, 1917. So prior to the snowfall. But this is what and of course, the light spot are all water-filled shell holes. Forming up an initial assault. One of the amazing things is despite all the difficulties, which I think is utterly remarkable in the conditions that prevail, is that the assembly went undetected prior to 0. It's absolutely certain. I looked at the German accounts and the British and the British accounts, and certainly the Germans were unaware of this. The Germans did have intelligence. There was a prisoner that informed the Hessian division that there was going to be an attack on the night of I believe it was the 28th of November. But when it didn't come, I'm not saying the Germans relaxed their guard, but a certain amount of surprise was achieved, as we'll see. So the forming up occurred, and it wasn't until movement was detected. It seems to have been primarily on the 32nd Division front, which is depicted here in this painting, which was done for the book by the artist Peter Dennis, who a lot of you may know from, for instance, the Osprey books. But what this shows is the 11th Border Regiment. They formed up, and they're now advancing in the low ground in front of the Patabeek stream towards the German position on that Cottages Ridge. And in the accounts, it says that all was quiet. As a matter of fact, let me just read you this excerpt. This is from an officer, Captain A. Fraser, of the 16th Highland Light Infantry. His battalion would have been to the right of the border regiment. And this is a very moving account from the history of the 16th Highland Light Infantry, which was published in 1930. Those of us who stood on the high ground near Bellevue at 0 hour, on that memorable morning will always retain a very vivid impression of the fight. It was a fine night and everything quiet on the front. The hillside on which we stood was bathed in moonlight, so that it was difficult to realize that within a few moments some 5 battalions would be advancing across that dark patch, down the valley, and that the stillness of the night air would be shattered by the rat-tat-tat of machine guns and the whine of high explosives. At 1:55 a.m., we knew our men had started, and we were glad that for the next 2 minutes everything was quiet. Suddenly, at 3 minutes to 2, came the sound of several enemy rifle shots, followed immediately by the ripple of a machine gun all along the front. Up went the SOS on both flanks of the attack. Still our artillery was silent. We knew that we could hope for no assistance from them until 3 minutes after the hour, and meantime, the enemy was having a free hand for 5 minutes on a target that looked grotesquely big against the bright moon. Some of the finest officers that ever wore the king's uniform went to their death with brave faces, well knowing that their chances of success were frail. And so you had your undetected assembly, and then at 0 plus 1/4 of a minute, the machine guns opened fire. From what I can gather, they were first from Peel Cottage in that vicinity, and then up and down the line. By 0 plus 7 minutes, the German machine guns achieved fire dominance, and this was crippling in officer and NCO casualties. So what you have by this time, and this is especially the case with the 32nd Division, is that you have men who don't really have any leaders to tell them what to do. And so by this time, of course, then the attack impetus is halted or disrupted within minutes of 0. So what happened? So this map depicts the situation by the dawn. But essentially, for the second, we start from right to left. For the 8th Division, 25th Brigade, the 2nd Royal Berks were able to successfully set up their flank iron opposite Exert Farm. They were also able to seize the southern redoubt, but they weren't able to hold it. And prior to daylight, a local German counterattack pushed them just to the outskirts of the redoubt. 2nd Lincolns were really unfortunate. They stopped at what they thought was their objective, but the reality of it was scrapings in front of Venison Trench. And except for a small a platoon on the far right, commanded by a 2nd lieutenant, they did not get into the objective at all. And by the time it was discovered, it was too late. For the 2nd Rifle Brigade, flanking fire coming from Hill 52 stopped their attack right in front of the northern redoubt, and they got nowhere with heavy losses for all the battalions. With 32nd Division on the left, it's a little more complicated. 2nd King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry seizes Hill 52 and are holding it by dawn. 16th Highland Light Infantry, there are a series of strong points in this area here, and they don't get very far. They sort of take a position up half right, as you can see here. 11th Border Regiment is the star turn for the 97th Brigade, and they advance as far as Mallet Copse, but they aren't able to hold it. And you have a ding-dong battle that occurs here from counterattacks that come from the direction of Mallet Wood in this swampy ground here, and also from the direction of Valuation Houses. 17th Highland Light Infantry, their attempts to seize Veal and Vat cottages gets absolutely nowhere. They're stopped, not far from their jump-off line. Whereas the 15th Lancashire Fusiliers gain a good portion of the very edge or the very tip of the Vat Cottages Ridge. And so 32nd Division, what you could say is limited advances and outright failure. 8th Division, capture and loss of Southern Redoubt, repulse opposite Venison Trench, and Northern Redoubt. So this attack breaks down. Henniker had always been against this operation, the GOC 8th Division. In fact, he referred to it at one point as a beastly operation. Didn't think much of it. Schutt, on the other hand, was certain they were going to be able to do this. He told everyone. Told the Army commander, Rawlinson. He told his unfortunate predecessor, General Strickland, who commanded the 1st Division in the attack on the 10th of November, that they were going to do this. And of course, Schutt thought he was leaving nothing to chance. I mean, a reinforced brigade plus a counterattack battalion. He was certain this was going to occur. And so what happens is that he tries to direct the battle from the bandbox and back from headquarters, which is all the way in the canal bank, just near Boisin. Excuse me. And he's basing his orders on erroneous information. So, for instance, he seemed to think from reports that came in that Veal Cottage has been that cottage has been captured, and wants a pincer movement to occur using the 11th border, and it's all cloud cuckoo land stuff. Certain that Hill 52 is in British hands, I can't blame him. But unfortunately, in the late morning, the German 94th Regiment launches a local counterattack and retakes Hill 52. And the Coilies are driven back to their front line. And worse is yet to come. Henniker, it seems to me, once the attack failed, he checks out. But Schutt continues to, excuse me, he's telephoning Blacklock and demanding that the attack continues. And what's great is, in the book, at this time, they were keeping transcripts of all the telegraph and telephone messages. So I know, or we know, what Schutt was telling Blacklock, and it was get on with it. And at one point, Schutt even comes up to a place called Kansas Cross. It's on the Zonnebeek, on the Zonnebeek Road north. He comes as far as there, and they have a meeting in the pillbox, and he insists that the attack continues. Unfortunately, by the late afternoon, the Germans launch counterattacks from the direction of, the 25th Division launches a counterattack. And it's totally broken up by the British artillery. The 38th Division launches counterattacks, which are quite successful. And they come from the direction of Valuation Houses and Mullet Farm. And what happens is, I think with the loss of so many officers and NCOs, the Germans just had to press a little bit. And I think the men had enough. And so Colonel Scully, who commands the counterattack battalion, he's back at his headquarters, and his report survives. And he sees men coming back in dribs and drabs from all these positions that they have gained. And this would probably be the Border Regiment and the 16th Highland Infantry Regiment. And he sends his companies in to try and get the attack going again. But he becomes concerned about his flanks, and he halts the attack, the counterattack, and they settle in almost on their front line again. So by that time, Schutt had sought permission to continue the assault on the 32nd Division front with GHQ and is awaiting an answer. But essentially, by dusk on the 2nd of December, for the most part, the British, not entirely, but are back on their original front line or just in front of the positions that they were to capture. The only one for 8th Division would be that platoon here on the far, on the, to the, in the southern part of the Venison Trench. So 8th Division and 32nd Division front on an evening of 3rd of December. So that evening, Schutt was contemplating sending in his 3rd Brigade, which would have been the I cannot remember the name of it now, but he was sending in his reserve brigade to get the attack going again. And Blacklock was told to continue to hold the line. If you look at this map, I always think it's such a depressing map. Here are your original objectives, and here is the ground gained in the attack, this red line. And so, as you can see, you have your flank guard here at Exert Farm. You have position in front of Southern Redoubt. The platoon that was holding that small section of trench abandoned it before dawn on the 3rd. And of course, in front of the Northern Redoubt. And then here for the 32nd Division, they're back where they started. You have some small ground gained here in front of Vocation Farm. And then you have, of course, with the 15th Lancashire Fusiliers attack, the part of the western tip of that Cottages Ridge. What's tragic is more positions were taken, more ground was gained here, but there was a mistake during the relief. When the Manchester Regiment came in, they took over positions that were too far to the south of the positions that were actually gained, and the Lancashire Fusiliers abandoned those positions in the north. It's understandable in the confusion that prevailed afterwards. So Schutt wanted to know whether he could continue the attack, and it's interesting to note that Henniger didn't ask to do this. It was Schutt that wanted to do this. And Schutt's obituary appeared, it's a very good obituary in the Rifle Brigade Chronicle for 1936. And they were singing his praises. And they said that when he commanded the 32nd Division, that every operation that he was in charge of was a success except one. And of course, it was this operation. And Schutt contacts Fourth Army Jacob of Second Corps and asks permission to continue. And Jacob doesn't have that authority. Jacob, the next authority would have been Fourth Army under Rawlinson, and queries Rawlinson. Well, Rawlinson didn't feel he had the authority either, so he contacts GHQ and talks to Haig's operations officer, Davidson. And Davidson's response is, it's quite interesting. It shows you how things can change, how when something that seemed necessary and important 12 hours before now isn't. But Davidson says that, given the current situation, we can't, justify continuing this attack and, and the wastage that might be caused, thereby. So what had changed? And of course, what happened on the 3rd of December was that is the day that the German government begins negotiations with the Bolsheviks to pull Russia out of the war. Also, in London, there's a cabinet meeting where the Secretary of State for War, Lord Derby, says, well, we need more men, given the situation of what's going on with Russia. And the cabinet, the Lloyd George government essentially says, well, no, we're not going to increase the drafts. And by this time, this early on, GHQ realizes that attacks that they have to go on, simply put, they have to go on the defensive. And just days later, Haig has a meeting with his army commanders. and it states officially, we're going on the defensive. And so this attack was shelved and ended. Certainly by the evening of 3rd of December, all the attacks are canceled. So what are the casualties? Well, British casualties, my estimation, was from Commonwealth war grave sources as opposed to official casualties in after action reports for both the 8th and 32nd Division, for 1,680 men killed, wounded, and missing, and about 80 were taken prisoner. That's over both divisions. I didn't break down on the slide here which division lost the most, but I believe it was 32nd Division lost the most men. Estimated casualties for the Germans, and I could only estimate them because reports that I looked at in German in German archives, the one report that I needed, they were all there, didn't have the report for this period. So my guess, based on the German regimental histories, was approximately 800 men killed, wounded, and missing. And I know that 96 were taken prisoner from British reports. So what did the commanders have to say about this operation? Well, this is from Henry Rawlinson's diary. The 32nd and 8th Divisions attacked at 1:55 a.m. this morning with limited objectives, and though they won some ground, they did not get very far forward. In the afternoon at 4:15 p.m., the Boche put in a strong counterattack and drove us back to our original line, which is very disappointing. We cannot, I fear, continue the offensive, as we have no fresh divisions and the reinforcements are coming in. So I have told corps to consolidate the line they are now on with a view of making it quite secure against attack. And keep in mind also that this operation is occurring at the time of the German counteroffensive at Cambrai, which opened on the 30th of November. General Shute, commander of 32nd Division. Reasons for the failure of the operation were disorganization, resulting from an attack delivered in darkness, accentuated by the loss of officers. Although night attacks have been carried out with complete success, it must be realized that we are now dealing with only partially trained troops, whose training and discipline may not be sufficiently good to enable them to surmount the difficulties of control entailed by an attack in the darkness. So at face value, what's Shute doing here? Well, he's blaming the men, you could say. And there is an argument for that. I certainly, when I was researching a Moonlight Massacre, looking at reports that were sent by divisions during 30, there were a lot of complaints about the kinds of drafts that they were getting. However, if any of you are aware of Alison Hines' book, which came out last year, about manpower in the BEF, 1916, 1918. Allison did some early research for me as I was preparing the book for publication, which I included as an appendix in the book. And one of the things that was happening at this time was that the Army itself, there was a quality control over the kind of drafts that they were getting, and that they would arrive from the base and they would be evaluated. And there would be a report that would be kept by the provost marshal of the division. And looking at example battalions, at least by Army standards, I think the battalions, one of the battalions she looked at was the 11th Border Regiment, was that of the drafts that they got prior to this attack, only 2 were considered to be untrained. So it's not to say that Shute was necessarily wrong, but certainly by Army standards, these men, the men that took part in this attack, were considered to be trained. And of course, I think where things break down is, a lack of initiative when your leaders are down, your officers and your NCOs. It's arguable. Some people think it's really reprehensible that have read the book and told me this, which Shute said, but I think that there are extenuating circumstances, and it's something we can only surmise on. Now, Henniker, of course, also had something to say about this operation. And It is quite damning. To attempt a surprise on a bright moonlit night, when bodies of men can be seen easily on the move at a distance of 300 yards, is not sound. Directly the right of 32nd Division and the left of 2nd Rifle Brigade rose at 0 hour in order to advance. The machine guns in Peel Cottage opened, and others north and west and east of them took it up almost at once. And I think what is a direct uh, criticism of shoot, I have heard it said that when snow is on. Oh, I'm sorry. I have heard it said that when snow is on the ground and when the night is bright with the moon full, bodies of men at 200 yards cannot be seen. This is not my experience. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, in his diary, and not the published one. This was very kindly shared with me by Dr. Jonathan Boff, who's written a very excellent book about Crown Prince Ruprecht. But this was in Ruprecht's diary, and it expands on what actually is in the published version. Prisoners of the British 32nd Division taken in last night's attack at Passchendaele report that 97th Brigade, which took part, suffered extremely heavy losses. The fighting strength of the companies is about 100 to 120 men. The first objective lay 200 meters from the British line. The second, 450 meters away. A prisoner of the British 8th Division captured at the Ritterhof, 500 meters from Passchendaele, said that the attack of his 25th Brigade succeeded without any artillery preparation. The objective was the German main line of resistance. What is remarkable about this is that, by the following day, they know the entire British plan. And interestingly enough, just as an aside, I was able to find at the Freiburg archives the interrogation reports concerning this particular operation. It's Fourth Army. They still survive. All the interrogation reports during 30 from British and French and prisoners, right, and of course Dominion, survive in that archive. And I was able to learn a lot about this prisoner that said that his attack succeeded without any artillery preparation. He was a sergeant, and he was in the Royal Berkshire Regiment, and he actually told his captors where guns were positioned behind the British line. Really gave the game away. The interrogation reports were also interesting in how they would categorize the men. Regulars, territorials, Kitchener volunteers, of course, and they're all, they can all be in different units. What's considered a regular unit or a territorial unit. And there was one that they referred to in particular who was called the London Merchant. And he told them something that they must have enjoyed so much. He said that the Gotha bombing of London had been so severe that something like a mass exodus had occurred. And of course, we're certainly not talking about the kind of bombing that occurred in the Second World War. So the Germans must have been very gratified to hear something like that. Anyway, I digress. So, in summing up this particular operation, strategic, operational, tactical conclusions. And one of the things I determined is that the decision to launch the night attack was unwise, given the uncompromising grand strategic and strategic situation during the winter of 1917-18. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, the writing on the wall as far as manpower is concerned, by early 1917, if not earlier than that, there were concerns that were being expressed, to replace wastage. Also, of course, the possibility of Russia leaving the war and allowing the Germans to focus, their strategy, on the Western Front with the coming spring offensives. All of this could have been foretold. So you could say, wishful thinking as far as continuing the Flanders campaign, but a realistic assessment of what was occurring around. There's a certain amount of hindsight in what I say, but you had two divisions that the 8th Division had fought at and the opening stages of the 30th campaign. It had heavy casualties, but was up to strength by the time this operation was launched. And 32nd Division had been up on the coast the entire time. So they were relatively up to strength, and might have been better to preserve them rather than have them partake in an operation like this. That said, when we're talking about Schutz's plan from a tactical point of view, it was the best that could be devised given the operational and tactical circumstances. The problem with Schutz's attack is that going in with the bayonet and avoiding the German counter barrage, there were difficulties in the deployment of artillery, in that the artillery that was supporting Schutz's attack could only fire from west to east in an attack that was taking place, that was going to be launched from south to north. Now, British gunners were able to do something like that by 1918, I'm told, but by this period of the war, they didn't have that skill, and so Schutt had really no other choice. They couldn't attack in daylight, and this was the best. The plan, in my opinion, was the best that could be devised in the circumstances. When you read the British accounts, and what I'm talking about is it's primarily the intelligence reports and the after-action reports, there is an assumed German foreknowledge of the attack, but that's erroneous. The Germans did not know this attack was coming, and so I can tell you that when, for instance, the 8th Division landed, they surprised the garrison in the Warfeld, so they overran them. Not so much on the 32nd Division front, where they appeared to have been forewarned because they saw them forming up in no man's land. They thought it was a relief, but once they began to move, that's when they opened fire. So, and lastly, I talked about the importance of the moonlight, and that night the moon was a waning gibbous, and I mentioned that it snowed, and I wondered, as far as Schutz's plan went, if they achieved a tactical surprise, and they were spotted forming up in no man's land on the 32nd Division front. Well, could there have been a correlation between the bright moonlight and the moon on the ground? And there is a book that was written by a former Wehrmacht general named Brigadier General Alfred Tolpa. And after the Second World War, it wasn't just rocket scientists that East and West wanted. Certainly as far as the Western powers went, in any possible conflict with the Soviet Union, they wanted to talk to these Wehrmacht generals and what they knew about fighting, the Red Army. And Tolpa was one of these people that the Americans took under their wing. And he wrote this very brief pamphlet. You can find it online, called it's a historical study, Night Combat. And this passage was the answer to my question. The effect of events taking place at night increases or decreases in proportion to the degree of darkness. Operations taking place during moonlight and starlit nights, especially across snow-covered terrain, may approximate daytime conditions. And so this doesn't seem to have been taken into account. They certainly, they had test runs with officers of battalions coming from the rear area to take up their frontline positions prior to zero on the 2nd of December. But no one seems to have taken this into account. And I think that is the real reason why the operation came cropper, and why no one heard about it. I mean, it was a complete shambles. So, briefly and lastly, defending the salient. What comes after this? Well, they don't really gain any of the ground they need, but they're not going to abandon this position. How could they? There was a report written by Hunter Weston's Major General Staff. It was that recommended falling all the way back to almost to the jump-off positions, because the ground was almost untenable in this particular, almost to the jumping-off positions of the 31st of July. And of course, that was not possible after all that months of fighting to abandon those positions. And so what to do? How do you hold the salient? And of course, they had another salient they had to contend with farther south, around Flequier, the Flequier salient, a result of the Battle of Cambrai. And Hunter Weston, of course, as I mentioned earlier, once this assault failed, he was given sole charge of this, and he was of the Passchendaele salient, and he was quite nervous about that because not only was Hunter Weston, a career soldier, but he was also a politician. He was an MP, and he was concerned about taking the blame should the German pinch out this salient. And it's really interesting. What he does is he writes this very lengthy report. You can find it in his papers at the British Library. And he sends it, he makes a note up and it says, sent by the hands of one of my officers. And at the top of the report, it's sent to Mrs. Hunter Weston. And he tells her to put it in his safe at home. And what does the report say? Well, it's quite balanced. It's correct in most everything that it says. But it's what I would call a CYA report. It's a cover your ass report. He's concerned for his reputation. And he wants to make sure that it's on record that if the Germans do pinch out this salient, that, he's done everything that he could, and, he's warned his superiors. He's not going to be made a scapegoat. And what they decide to do is they're going to hold the salient, and they do this in Flequier also. They're going to hold it in a series of outposts in the front line. Should the Germans put pressure on it, they're going to fall back to the cord. And that's where your main resistance will be. So it will collapse like a bag. And so that's how the position was held. And I think you all know that with the coming of the Lys offensive in mid-April 1918, all of this is abandoned when the BEF, when Second Army falls back to the outskirts of Ypres. And of course, interestingly enough, Hunter Weston is still holding that position at the time, and he oversees the withdrawal. So that ultimately, as far as those positions and gaining those observation points, that's the end of the story. We mentioned the late John Cooksey earlier. On the 2nd of December 2017, the 100th anniversary of this operation, a self-funded, very modest memorial was erected just outside of West Rosabika, and it has a memorial plaque listing the units that were involved, and then this orientation map here, and it can be visited. It's on private property, but they have a car park because it's an events place, and it can be visited. And if you have time, anybody that visits the battlefield, if you want to survey the ground where the operation takes place, do visit the memorial also. And that brings us to the questions.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thanks very much indeed. Could I just ask people, by way of appreciation, if you've enjoyed that, could you raise your hands using the button below? Oh, yeah. Numbers are flying up, Michael. People are clapping you in silence. Thank you very much. If you want to put your hands down.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah. If you want to ask questions, we've already had some coming in. Obviously, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just while Michael gathers his thoughts and perhaps has a drink of water, a couple of things that he named check there. He mentioned about Alison Hine writing a book on manpower, and he also talked about Hunter Weston. There are things on the Western Front Association YouTube channel on both those subjects if you want to have a look for it. Okay, so the questions are coming in, Michael, and the plan on this occasion is that I'll read them out for Michael to answer. So the first question is from William Rosenfeld. Were there any meteorological resources available before the attack which would have clarified the visibility of the moon on the snow?
No. There were, I did examine the Second Army meteorological chart. Well, not the meteorological chart, but the chart that shows the phases of the moon, which they obviously use. There was a meteorological station in Vlamertinghe that provided some information, but the snowstorm seems to have been entirely unpredictable. And it wasn't a severe storm, it just coated the ground enough to increase the visibility of the attackers. But as I stated earlier, it doesn't seem to have registered with anyone that it could be a problem. Maybe Henniker. If I may, let me just go back to the one slide with Henniker. I have heard it said that when snow is under, that is the only mention of the snow as a consequence of the attack, in a sense that it was discussed just prior to, but nothing in the archives that I have it has survived. And someone like Hunter Weston is quite interesting. He has his diaries are quite lengthy, but he focuses on the unimportant. So he'll go on about how he saw some old friend from Gallipoli, or he visited some unit, but what he'll write, like, met with Jacob to discuss operation. That's as much as I could get, So I could only really rely on the documents. But as far as Mr. Rosenthal's question goes, that particular line right there is the only thing that I discovered in the hundreds of documents that I looked at related to the attack, where the snow is mentioned, possibly as being ex post facto, because of course this is in Henniker's after action.
Okay, thank you, Michael. There's another question closely related from James Gordon Cumming, who says,
"Hi, James." I know James.
Okay. How was Shute allowed to blame darkness for why the attack didn't work, when in fact it was quite the opposite? Henniker's report confirmed bright moonlight. So Shute blamed the darkness. Henniker confirmed it was bright moonlight.
And that's an interesting question, and I certainly didn't. I certainly didn't touch on that in the book, but my take on it is that it's relative darkness, in that it's not a daylight attack. We're attacking at night, and there is moonlight that assists the attack to a certain degree, so they can keep formation and direction. I don't think anybody would challenge him. Certainly, they all agreed to his plan, but I think he's just basically saying, well, even if it's in relative darkness, it's still darkness. But yeah, I see Jim's point. I don't really know how to interpret that other than the way that I am, in that it's a night attack. It's a night attack in that it's dark, but there's moonlight.
Okie dokie. So James Taub, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. James Taub.
Hi, James. I know him too.
Okay. Since the 32nd Division had not seen previous service in the salient during the campaign, do you believe that they were at a disadvantage to formations such as the 8th, who had experience with the German defensive system in Flanders?
That's a really good question. To a certain degree, but they also, prior to the attack, they had taken over positions opposite that Cottages Ridge in Hill 52 towards the end of November. And all of the battalions had done some frontline duty. So they were aware of the conditions. And certainly Schutz's planning and preparations were quite thorough. There were the usual kind of practice attacks. There was a papier-mâché relief diorama made for men to be instructed on. What else? I think that they were as thorough as they could be. Certainly, I think previous duty in the line would have made them aware, but I also think it's possible that there was a slight disadvantage. I mean, their introduction to the conditions that we associate with Passchendaele were certainly at that late, terrible stage in the campaign. So I think there's something to it, but I think it can also be overstated.
Okay. So Mark Armstrong asks, Today we take the 24-hour battlefield as normal business, with the use of things like night vision to fight at night. How common were night attacks on this scale, and had they rehearsed the attack prior to moving up onto the ridge?
To answer the second question first, yes, they had rehearsed it. And if you read, goodness, I cannot remember the name of the report now. There was a report that was compiled by the War Office and published in the early, I mentioned it in the book, I just cannot recall the name of it on top of my head, where they talked about the efficacy of night attacks, and particularly on other fronts. But, as I said earlier, Schutt was a real proponent of night attacks. What was interesting and how I discovered that, I was quite lucky. Professor Gary Sheffield from the librarian at Shrivenham brought to his attention that Schutt had delivered some lectures in 1920. And one of them, I don't know, it didn't have a title, but what I would call it is What I Learned in the Last War. And one of the things that he says in there, and this is a quote, night attacks, good, not bad. And then he elaborates on why that is. But certainly there were a lot of advantages to attacking at night, provided you could maintain that direction and formation and get yourself onto the objective. And I mentioned about that attack. It was on Pouzier and River Trench in February 1917. This was when Schutt commanded the Royal Naval Division, which was a success. And Cyril Falls, in the Official Historian, Volume 1, 1917, where this attack is covered, says that the attack was a success. It was interesting, inasmuch as the men advanced over ground covered with snow under a full moon. And so this was something that certainly someone like Schutt, was a proponent of. But in mentioning that report to you, and maybe someone in the audience can remember the name of it. I just, off the top of my head, I can't remember it now. But they talk about how important night attacks were in gaining objectives. I mean, what's one of the most famous ones? On the Somme on the 14th of July, on the Battle of Byzantine Ridge. And who's the commander for that? It was Rawlinson. And Rawlinson wrote a piece on night attacks for the RUSI in 1909, which I also looked at. And I can sort of, I'm surmising a lot of this, but you can, you can understand why with an attack that Schutt planned and basing that attack on Schutt's plan, ignoring what Henniker was saying, is because they believed in these sorts of attacks, that they could be successful. Certainly in 1918, you have some very successful night attacks. And one when Schutt went on to command 5th Corps in 1918. And there was one, I believe, that was launched by the 18th Division. And but of course, it's questionable how much influence Schutt as a corps commander would have had on this particular attack, because it seems by this time in the advance to victory that a lot of these divisions and brigades, are operating not independently, but they are taking into hands operations and the what's the word, the tempo. And so I couldn't, not having studied that particular night attack in 1918, I can't say how much influence Schutt would have had on it. But it seems to have originated with one of the brigades in the 18th Division. But maybe somebody that's aware of it could correct me on that. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. Patrick Crozier asks, can you tell us a bit more about the absence of British artillery in this operation, particularly why it was west to east rather than south to north?
I sure can. Let me go back to an earlier slide, and I can explain it to you. Let's look at the this is okay. Let's look at the before the jump off. Okay, so here was the problem with the artillery. The 8th Division is attacking to the northeast. Here's your boundary. The 8th Division is attacking to the northeast. And there is artillery within the salient that can support their attack. It's where the 32nd Division has a problem, in that there's not enough artillery to support attack to the northeast by the 8th Division and one to the north by the 32nd Division. So the artillery that could support the 32nd Division attack and would have once they seized their objectives was based to the west. The west in this direction. As a matter of fact, it might even help us to go to another map here. Bear with me here. Go to this one here. Now that I've showed you that. Here. So it would be, here's the Cottages Ridge. So your artillery would be deployed here. And it would, and the artillery fire would be what they call a concentration bombardment. So they would just bombard targets from west to east in a series of concentration points along the ridge in the vicinity of Hill 52 and the rear areas and whatever else. But it's not very effective. You can't do a creeper in this particular attack. But you really could have done a creeper anyway, because Schutt can't attack in the daytime. Attacking in daylight, I mean, the Germans on Hill 52, they can see everything that's forming up in the Passchendaele Valley below the Vat Cottages Ridge. It was impossible. And what seems to me is that my guess would be is that the 8th Division that was the main operation. But 32nd Division's difficulties, they seemed almost so insurmountable that when Schutt came up with this scheme, everything became subordinated to that. And any contingencies, as I mentioned earlier, that Henniker wanted to put into place. One was even as simple as one of his battalion commanders, the commander of the 2nd Lincolns, Lieutenant Colonel NMS Irwin, would fire a Very pistol. And a barrage would then open up on the German main line of resistance, but they wouldn't allow it. In Schutt's lecture that he delivered in 1920, he says something to the effect of, once you adopt a plan, you stick to it, but then you suffer, you take the consequences for the failure. Okay, and of course, that's debatable considering on his response whether he actually really did that or not. But, he'd come up with this plan, and he didn't want anything that 8th Division might do to compromise it to be permitted. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, both corps commanders agreed, and Hunter Weston overruled Henniker. And Henniker was quite upset. He writes in his diary that, I lost so many numbers. I can't remember the number of the 8th Division separately. It's in the 600 range. And 2 very good battalion commanders, although one of the battalion commanders was mortally wounded in that German riposte that captured Peel Cottage. And then the other one was Roger Brand. He was wounded and when they were forming up for the attack on the northern redoubt. But anyway, I digress again.
Okay. Related to that, Richard Smith asks, what level of artillery was actually involved?
Well, the batteries, you mean?
Just says what level of artillery was involved.
Well, honestly, I'd have to look at. It's all detailed in the book, but the level would be division and corps. There were some batteries that would have been heavy batteries that were involved, but they were firing into the rear areas, at some distance, nodal points and things like that. But it would be field guns, counter battery, all those sorts of things. But none of them, they couldn't. They were all to remain silent for the first 8 minutes, and of course the operation is compromised by that. But within the book, all of the artillery is all of the artillery involved is. You can find it in there, the batteries and everything else. It's all mentioned in the book.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, I can't do that one in detail. I just okay. Off the top of my head, I don't recall anymore.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions. Gordon Holmes asks, was there any air cover up that night? And if so, might this indicate to the Germans that something was afoot?
No. It's very interesting. The only aircraft that were involved in the operation were to fly over the lines uh, in the morning and detect what was going on. And there was a problem flying at those low altitudes. There were two squadrons involved. It was number 7 for the 8th Division and number 21 for the 32nd Division. Or actually, I should say number 7 for the, if I'm correct about this, number 7 for the 8th Corps and number 21 for the, am I right about this? No, I'm sorry, number 7 for the 2nd Corps and 21 Squadron for the 8th Corps. And they couldn't get up right away. And it was actually where there's an account by an aviator that I include in the narrative about what he found, and he could see the men in front of the Southern Redoubt, for instance, but he didn't think that there were any British troops within the redoubt itself, which was absolutely correct because it had been lost before dawn. But they weren't able to get up in the air. It's interesting though. There's a diary in there I quote by a fighter pilot. And he's up in the air first thing in the morning, but he's at a very high altitude. I'm not an expert on this, but it seems to me that uh, uh, the aircraft didn't supply the intelligence that was needed to the commanders until there wasn't any use for them until daybreak, and by that time the operation had broken down. I can't see in that the British formed up at night that the Germans would have been able to discern anything themselves. About detecting the operation. The only thing that the Germans knew, to reiterate, based on the intelligence documents and interrogation documents that I looked at, was that the British were going to attack. They didn't know when. And if they attacked, the only way that they were going to be able to do it was where they had a proper footing on the ridge, meaning in the low ground, it was impossible to traverse. It was a swamp. So you had good going on the ridge. So they knew if the British attacked, it would have to be on the ridge, and it would have to be in this area here that you see, on the ridge itself. You weren't going to be attacking, across these wastes in front of West Trosipik and below in this northern portion of the Passchendaele Ridge. And of course, they were. If you see, they have most of the ridge here, captured in your final attacks, and it's just this part and some other outcrops that remain. And so they know that they're not certain yet when the offensive is going to be at an end. Even with the attack at Cambrai, it isn't until the 5th of December that the Kaiser sends a congratulatory message to the Fourth Army for its defensive battles, from July, in through December. And that's another interesting thing about the Moonlight Massacre attack is that to the Germans, if you read the Reichsarchive on what's called Flanders, 1917, to them, the attack on the 2nd of December is the last attack, even though, and there wasn't time to go into it, there wasn't a small New Zealand attack the next morning on Polderhoek Chateau, farther to the south, by 2 battalions. And they were actually linked in one of the army orders that I saw, but they decided to attack at different times. And that's interesting, is that attack went in at noon. They were hoping that the Germans would be eating lunch and not paying attention. And of course, it didn't work either, okay? But the last big attack to the Germans, the end of the 30th campaign, is this particular operation that, in the Anglophone literature, up until recently, and I don't just mean my book, I know Jack Sheldon, for instance, the great Jack Sheldon, in his book, The German Army of Passchendaele, touches on it. But generally speaking, in most Anglophone books, it's entirely ignored until recently, obviously.
Okay, thank you. And the final question is from Barry Jones, who says, what have you been working on since 2014?
Oh, well, I published some articles. No, I published some chapters in Spencer Jones edited volumes, which some of the audience might be aware of. I have coming out next month or the month after an edited volume of Major General Cecil Pereira, was a Coldstreamer, his wartime letters that had never been published before. The book has been co-edited with the grandson, Edward Pereira, and Spencer Jones. And my most recent, I have another Spencer Jones chapter that's coming out. Some of you, if you've read about trench raids, there was a trench raid where the Germans near Loos in early 1917 raided the British lines, took 51 prisoners, and left a placard for the divisional general to see the next morning when he was trying to figure out what happened that said, "Say, what about those 50 rations?" And it's I first read about this in F.C. Hitchcock's wonderful Stand to a Diary of the Trenches, which was published in 1936 and has been reprinted since then. It's a classic. And it's mentioned in a lot of other books, and I wanted to know the story about what happened with this. And so based on British and German sources, I've written an account about this very embarrassing raid that took place in the Loos salient in the winter of 1916-17. It was on the 5th of January. So that will be published, I think, sometime next year. And I will be starting my next big book, which will probably be about the German attack at Saint-Eloi in March 1915, which is famous, amongst other things, for the young man who Peter Pan was based on, one of the lost boys of J.M. Barrie. He was killed in that particular operation with the Rifle Brigade.
Thank you. Well, that's it for the questions. Thank you very much indeed, Michael. A recording of this will appear on the Western Front Association's YouTube channel in about a week's time. I'd just like to say, though, before we terminate, that you've mentioned John Cooksey once or twice as you've gone through, and members will be aware that his family has set up a fundraising page, details of which are available on the WFA website. You may not be aware, though, that the WFA has offered to match pound for pound all donations made by members of the WFA, providing that they identify themselves as such in the comments, so some reference to WFA. Michael, it just remains for me to thank you. It's been a very informative chat. There have been a lot of questions. Could people still raise their hands just to show a final appreciation? They're flying up again. I don't know if you can see it, Michael, but we can see all the participants' hands going up.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Simon and David, for helping me with this technology, and it was a pleasure. It's been a while since I've been able to, deliver any kind of presentation. I did feel a little rusty tonight, but it all comes with just getting back into it again. And thank you for your patience. And I just wanted to mention that I didn't mention it earlier, but the paperback revised edition of the Moonlight Massacre I'm told now, will be out next year, sometime probably in early 2021. So if you don't own the book already and you're interested in reading it, keep an eye out for it.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, I'll be in touch with you tomorrow, but thanks ever so much.
Thank you, sir.
So I think on that note,
thank you, everyone.
We'll say goodnight to everyone and see you. Oh, just to remind you, there's another webinar on Thursday, which from memory, I think is about Indian troops on the Western Front. David will shout at me if I've got that wrong, but that's Thursday evening. Okay, good night, folks, and thanks again, Michael.
Thank you.
Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous.